History has never been short on terrible kings, but the queens had to be twice as ruthless just to get half the credit, and a handful of them cleared that bar so hard that people still flinch at their names thousands of years later. Here's the twist though. Some of these women earned every drop of their bloody reputation, and some got smeared by men who simply couldn't stand watching a woman run the show. So let's go era by era and try to sort the genuine monsters from the victims of a really good rumor. Athaliah, the grandchild killer. We start back in the 9th century BC, in the little kingdom of Judah, with a woman who holds a record nobody puts on a resume. Athaliah is the only woman to ever rule Judah in her own right, and according to the story, she got there by murdering her own family tree. When her son, King Ahaziah, got himself killed, Athaliah looked at the line of succession and saw a row of small grandchildren standing between her and the crown. So, the account says, she had them slaughtered, her own grandchildren. That is one creative way to win an argument at Sunday dinner. But one baby slipped through the net. A boy named Joash got smuggled out by his aunt Jehosheba and hidden inside the temple for 6 full years, while Athaliah sat on a throne she thought she'd swept clean. The mastermind was the high priest Jehoiada, who spent those 6 years quietly raising the hidden prince inside the temple complex, while Athaliah ruled, completely unaware that the one heir she'd missed was growing up a few hundred feet away. When the boy turned 7, Jehoiada armed the palace guards, crowned Joash in front of the assembled crowd, and the people erupted. Athaliah heard the noise, came running, tore her clothes, and screamed treason, which is a bold accusation from the woman who allegedly murdered the rest of the family to grab the crown. They hauled her out of the sacred space so they wouldn't spill blood inside it, and killed her at the horse gate. She had quietly broken the entire royal bloodline of King David, the only ruler in the story ever to do it, and her grip lasted exactly 6 years before a hidden 7-year-old erased it. The grim cherry on top. Joash, the miracle baby everyone risked their lives to save, grew up to become a king who reportedly ordered the murder of Jehoiada's own son. Nobody in this family was getting a wholesome ending. Now here's where I have to be honest with you, because we're doing accuracy today. Every word of this comes from the Bible, specifically the book of 2 Kings, and there is not one outside source to confirm any of it. The men writing the story also happen to despise her for worshipping a foreign god, which is precisely the kind of motive that turns history into a hit piece. There's even a scholarly fight over who her parents were, with some arguing the writers deliberately tied her to the infamous Queen Jezebel to make her look worse. Child-killing tyrant? Or foreign queen written up by people who hated her? Honestly, we can't prove it either way. Great start to the list. Olympias, sword, noose, poison. Jump to the 4th century BC and the absolute chaos after Alexander the Great died. His mother, Olympias, had spent her whole life as a fierce, scheming presence at the edge of power. And when she finally grabbed control of Macedon around 317 BC, she did not waste the opportunity. She captured the rival royal couple, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother Philip III and his ambitious wife Eurydice, and she went to work. Philip got stabbed to death by a squad of Thracian assassins. Then Olympias sent Eurydice a truly chilling care package, a sword, a noose, and a cup of hemlock, with a message basically telling her to choose how she wanted to die. Eurydice picked the noose and hanged herself with her own belt. For an encore, Olympias executed around 100 leading Macedonians loyal to her enemy Cassander, and killed his brother for good measure. This was not subtle politics, this was a purge, and she was terrifying long before any of this. The biographer Plutarch tells us Olympias was a devoted follower of the wild, ecstatic cults of Dionysus, and that she kept large tame snakes that would slither out during the religious rituals, coiling around the sacred objects, and, allegedly, around her while she slept. Her own husband, King Philip, was reportedly so unnerved by finding a serpent stretched out beside his wife in bed that it cooled the whole marriage. When your villain origin story already includes casually sleeping with snakes to unsettle your husband, the later throne room purges almost qualify as a natural career progression. Karma came collecting fast. Cassander cornered her the very next year. But here's the genuinely wild part. When the soldiers arrived to kill her, Olympias put on her full royal robes and stood there flanked by 2 of her women, and the men flat out could not do it. They refused to execute Alexander's mother, so Cassander handed the job to the families of the people she had killed, and they reportedly stoned her to death in the street. A queen so feared and so legendary that her own assassins lost their nerve, finally taken down by a mob of grieving relatives. Worth remembering that our sources are late and written by the side that won, so the purge is real but the bloodthirsty witch flavor is cranked up. Still, the sword noose poison gift basket genuinely happened, and it remains one of the coldest things any queen ever mailed. Agrippina, strike the womb. Now to Imperial Rome in the 1st century AD, and a woman related to absolutely everyone terrible. Agrippina the Younger was the sister of the Emperor Caligula, the wife of the Emperor Claudius, and the mother of the Emperor Nero, If that family had a group chat, it would be a crime scene. She was so prominent, she became the first living empress to appear on Roman coins, and she renamed her birthplace after herself, a city we still call Cologne. Agrippina married her own uncle Claudius, which was already a scandal. And then, the story goes, she poisoned him with a plate of mushrooms in the year 54 to put her teenage son Nero on the throne. The poison supposedly came from a professional named Locusta, and when Claudius didn't die fast enough, his own doctor allegedly finished the job with a poisoned feather down the throat. Mother of the year. The entire scheme existed to make Nero emperor, and against all odds, she pulled it off. The problem with raising a monster is that one day, he outgrows you. Nero got sick of his mother's control and tried to murder her in the single most ridiculous way imaginable. He built her a special boat designed to fall apart and sink on its own out at sea, a booby-trapped yacht, so she'd drown in a tragic accident with his hands technically clean. The cabin collapsed, the boat refused to sink, and Agrippina simply swam to shore in the dark. So Nero gave up on being clever and just sent a gang of men to club and stab her in her own villa. The historian Tacitus says that as the killers closed in, she tore open her robe, pointed at her belly, and told them to strike the womb that had carried Nero. And the line that haunts her, from years before when astrologers warned that her son would rule and then kill her, is chillingly simple. Let him kill me, as long as he becomes emperor. She got both halves of that wish in order. Suetonius even claims Nero came to inspect the corpse afterward and critiqued her body part by part, the way a bored shopper picks apart a couch he's decided to return. One detail people forget. This wasn't Agrippina's first brush with a murderous relative. Her own brother Caligula had banished her to a tiny island years earlier and seized her property, and she only clawed back to power after he was assassinated. She had watched, up close, exactly how Roman power chewed people up, and she still decided the smart play was to manufacture an emperor and stand behind him. The student, unfortunately, outmonstered the teacher. Fredegund died in bed. The early Middle Ages gave us a queen who started at the absolute bottom and climbed using a body count as a staircase. Fredegund began as a household servant, essentially a slave, in 6th century Frankish Gaul. She ended up Queen of Neustria, and she spent roughly 40 years locked in a personal blood feud with a rival queen named Brunhilde that dragged whole kingdoms into war. The deeds attributed to her are genuinely staggering. A rival royal wife, Galswintha, strangled in her bed so Fredegund could take her place. A king named Sigibert, stabbed to death with poisoned blades at the exact moment he thought he had won. A bishop knifed at the altar during the Easter service, because apparently nothing was off limits. She even, the story goes, tried to murder her own daughter Regunth by slamming the heavy lid of a treasure chest down on the girl's neck, while she leaned in to admire the jewels inside. And she wasn't only an assassin, she was a real battlefield commander who once won a surprise night attack by disguising her soldiers with leafy tree branches and tying bells onto the horses, so the enemy scouts heard the jingling and assumed it was just cattle wandering through the dark. What makes Fredegund extra dangerous is that none of this was reckless rage. It was strategy. Every rival she removed cleared a path for her own son, the future Clothar II, and when her husband Chilperic was assassinated, she didn't crumble. She grabbed the royal treasure, secured her young son's claim, and ruled as regent in his name, steering the kingdom with the same cold focus she'd used to empty it of rivals. The servant girl had turned herself into the most powerful person in the Frankish world. Here's the kicker that makes her stand out from this entire list. After a lifetime of arranging poisonings and stabbings, Fredegund died peacefully in her own bed of old age in 597, surrounded by comfort, having basically gotten away with all of it. Meanwhile, her rival Brunhilde, the queen the chroniclers adored and described as gentle, was eventually tied to wild horses and torn limb from limb. The man who wrote most of this down, Gregory of Tours, was firmly on Brunhilde's side, so the tidy good queen versus evil queen scorecard deserves a heavy grain of salt, but you do have to grudgingly respect a villain who actually lands the quiet retirement. Wu Zetian, the blank stone. In the 7th century China, we meet the only woman in more than 2,000 years of Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name, not as somebody's wife or stand-in regent, but as the actual emperor with her own dynasty. Wu Zetian started as a low-ranking teenage concubine and ended up the single most powerful person in the world's largest empire. The ambition is off the charts, so is the body count, if you believe the stories. The most infamous accusation is brutal. When Wu's newborn daughter died in her crib, she reportedly accused the reigning empress of murdering the baby, and the darker version says Wu smothered her own infant daughter with her own hands just to frame her rival and destroy her. It worked perfectly. The empress was disgraced and removed. Wu rose to take her place, and her deposed rivals were supposedly mutilated and drowned in giant vats of wine. She then built an informer network with a famous copper box where any citizen could drop an anonymous accusation against a neighbor, and she used it to purge the old aristocracy with terrifying efficiency. But this is the big one for our accuracy theme, so lean in. Almost all of the truly monstrous material comes from Confucian historians writing centuries after she was dead, one of the most important of them, a full 350 years later. The baby murder story is suspiciously absent from the writings of her actual living enemies, and it weirdly mirrors crimes pinned on an earlier Chinese empress, almost as if a later writer reached for a ready-made template. Meanwhile, the real Wu Zetian stabilized a shaky empire, expanded the examination system so that talent could outrank noble birth, and lowered taxes on farmers. She was so confident in her own authority that she invented brand new Chinese characters and forced them into official use, including a special one for her own name that combined the symbols for the sun and the moon shining together in the sky. Imagine being so powerful you redesign the alphabet to make a point about yourself. And when she died, she left one final flourish that historians still argue about. A massive memorial stone at her tomb, deliberately left totally blank, not a single character carved into it, as if she were daring the future to write her story for her. Bold move from a woman who knew exactly who'd be holding the pen. Isabella, the she-wolf myth. The late Middle Ages bring us a queen with the scariest nickname on the entire list, the she-wolf of France. Her name was Isabella, a French princess married off to King Edward II of England around 1308, and she pulled off something almost no queen in history had ever done. She invaded her own husband's kingdom and took it away from him. Before the invasion, Isabella had already proven she was nobody to cross. Years earlier, back in France, she's the one who spotted that her three brothers' wives were carrying on a secret affair with two young knights, and she quietly reported it to her father, the king. The scandal, later known as the Tour de Nesle affair, detonated the French royal family. The princesses were imprisoned and the knights were brutally executed. So the woman about to topple an English king had already helped blow up the marriages of half the French court without lifting a sword. Edward was a political disaster who lavished all his attention, money, and power on a series of male favorites while publicly ignoring and humiliating his wife, even seizing her lands and her children. So Isabella went home to France, teamed up with an exiled English baron named Roger Mortimer, who became both her lover and her general, and she landed back in England with a small army in 1326. The English nobles were already so fed up with Edward that they defected to her almost on arrival, and the invasion was nearly bloodless. Edward's hated favorite was executed in gruesome public fashion. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in early 1327, the first English king ever shoved off his own throne, and he was conveniently dead within months. Isabella and Mortimer then ran the country, and enriched themselves shamelessly, until her own teenage son, Edward III, launched a midnight coup at Nottingham Castle, hanged Mortimer, and quietly put his mother into comfortable retirement. Now for the myths, because this story is absolutely stuffed with them. That horrifying legend that Edward II was murdered with a red-hot poker shoved into his body almost certainly invented propaganda, and it only started circulating after Mortimer was already executed, conveniently painting the fallen regime as a pack of monsters. Some historians even doubt Edward died at Berkeley Castle at all. And the terrifying she-wolf nickname she's known by? She never once heard it in her life. A poet stuck that label on her around 400 years later, in 1757, borrowing it from a phrase Shakespeare had used for an entirely different queen. The real Isabella was a sharp, capable woman pushed past her breaking point by a useless husband, and when she finally died, she was buried with that same husband's heart resting on her chest after holding onto it for roughly 30 years. Complicated woman, not exactly the snarling beast the brand is selling. Catherine. The botched hit. The Renaissance gives us Catherine de' Medici, an Italian banker's daughter married into the French royal family who, after her husband died in a freak jousting accident, became the most powerful person in France, ruling through one weak son after another during the savage French wars of religion. Her whole life practically begged for a sinister reputation. She was married off at just 14, then spent roughly a decade unable to produce a child, while the court whispered and her husband openly adored his mistress, before finally having 10 kids in a rush. And she really did surround herself with astrologers and fortune-tellers, including the most famous prophet of the age, Nostradamus, whom she brought to court and consulted personally. So before she ever touched a real political crisis, Catherine already carried the public profile of a spooky foreign widow who chats with prophets. That image did her absolutely no favors once the bodies started piling up. Her reputation rests on one horrifying stretch of nights. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, in August 1572, kicked off during her own daughter's wedding celebration and exploded into a slaughter of Protestant Huguenots that spread from Paris across the country for weeks. The death toll estimates run from a couple thousand in Paris to as many as tens of thousands nationwide. Bodies genuinely clogged the River Seine, and Catherine got branded the Great Italian Poisoner, the witch queen pulling every string from the shadows, complete with persistent rumors of a squad of beautiful ladies-in-waiting she used as sexual spies to seduce secrets out of powerful men. Here's the more careful version that historians now lean toward, and it's somehow both more forgivable and more horrifying at once. The evidence suggests Catherine wanted a precise, targeted hit, the assassination of a small handful of Huguenot leaders, chiefly the Admiral Coligny. That part she very likely did order. But the strike was botched. Fear and rage tore through an already armed city, and the whole thing spiraled into an uncontrolled mass killing that was never the actual plan. So no, she's not innocent, she absolutely helped light the fuse. But the popular image of a criminal mastermind coldly engineering a nationwide religious genocide is largely a creation of Protestant pamphlets that desperately needed a foreign woman to blame. Even that infamous squad of seductive spies, the so-called Flying Squadron, doesn't appear in the historical record until more than 100 years after Catherine was dead. Half her legend is real, the other half is pure marketing. Ranavalona, the poison test. Now we reach the 19th century and a queen who may genuinely top this entire list on sheer numbers killed. Ranavalona I seized the throne of Madagascar in 1828 and ruled for 33 years as a ferocious isolationist, absolutely determined to kick European influence, traders, and Christian missionaries out of her kingdom for good. Her signature was a justice system that sounds like it was designed inside a nightmare. It was called the Tangina ordeal. If you were accused of almost anything, from a crime to witchcraft to simply being disloyal, you were forced to swallow poison extracted from a tree nut, along with 3 pieces of chicken skin. If you managed to vomit up all 3 pieces of skin, you were declared innocent. If you didn't, you were guilty, and frequently you were just dead, because the poison killed somewhere between a fifth and half of everyone who took it. This was not some rare ceremony. By some estimates, it was killing around 3,000 people every single year, and in one catastrophic year, the toll from her policies may have reached into the tens of thousands. She banned Christianity in 1835, punished and executed believers by the hundreds, and worked staggering numbers of her own subjects to death through forced labor and constant military campaigns. Accuracy note, because it absolutely matters here too. The atrocities are real, and they were enormous, but the most jaw-dropping statistics, such as the claim that her kingdom's population was cut clean in half in just 6 years, come straight from missionary and colonial sources who had every possible reason to paint her as a bloodthirsty madwoman. Modern scholars treat those exact figures with real caution, partly because nobody was actually counting. There's even a serious movement now to reframe Ranavalona as an early anti-colonial leader fighting to keep European empires from swallowing her country whole. And here's the uncomfortable part. Both of those things can be true at the same time. She was resisting an empire that genuinely wanted to take her land, and she was poisoning her own people by the thousands to do it. Cixi, 2,000 times. We finish in the modern era with the woman who effectively ran China for nearly half a century, the Empress Dowager Cixi. She started out as a minor teenage concubine, and, through one perfectly timed palace coup, ended up the real power behind the throne, from 1861 all the way to 1908, governing through first her young son and then her nephew, while seated behind a silk screen. For a solid century, she was the ultimate dragon lady of the Western imagination, a scheming, murderous, sexually monstrous tyrant who supposedly bathed in cruelty. And a shocking amount of that exact image traces back to a single con man, a British forger named Edmund Backhouse, who literally faked a Chinese official's diary, fooled serious historians with it for around 50 years, and privately bragged in his memoirs about a steamy sexual relationship with the Empress that 100% never happened. So a huge slice of her monstrous reputation is, no exaggeration, fan fiction written by a fraud with a vivid imagination. She also backed the disastrous Boxer Rebellion in 1900 and actually declared war on the combined Western powers at once, which went about as well as you'd expect. And there's a famous bit of pettiness baked into her legend. She's long been accused of siphoning money meant to modernize China's navy into renovating her gorgeous summer palace, where she had a lavish 2-story pavilion built out of marble in the literal shape of a boat. A stone boat that can't float, paid for with the fleet's budget, while the real navy got humiliated at sea. Whether or not the accounting was exactly that simple, it's the kind of detail that tells you why people were ready to believe anything about her. But then there's the one charge that simply refuses to go away, because actual science came along and backed it up. Her reform-minded nephew, the Guangxu Emperor, had been kept under house arrest for years after he tried to modernize the country against her wishes, and he died very suddenly in November 1908, exactly one day before Cixi herself died. For a century, that suspicious timing was just a rumor, people whispered. Then in 2008, researchers exhumed and tested his remains, and they found arsenic in his body at levels roughly 2,000 times higher than normal. One enormous, deliberate dose. He was murdered, full stop, no debate. Nobody can prove Cixi personally gave the order, but the timing points a very loud finger right at her. So she's the perfect queen to end on, because she proves our entire point inside one person. Most of her evil was invented by an Englishman with a typewriter, and her one provable crime stayed hidden inside a strand of hair for 100 years before anyone could nail it down, which tells you the hardest job in all of history isn't finding an evil queen. It's figuring out which ones were truly monsters, and which ones just made the unforgivable mistake of winning while female.